Senior fellow at CIPA, Center of European Policy Analysis. And last but not least, Julia Berghofer, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Leadership Network. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to my wonderful panelists and to pose the first question. And my first question goes to Angus. So what is your take? What is the impact of war in Ukraine and Putin's constant saber-rattling on the nuclear taboo? Is it being weakened or strengthened?
Well, thank you, Margarita, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm pretty certain that actually the nuclear taboo is as strong today as it's ever been. I also think deterrence works as well today as it has ever done. There is a reason why Russia has not attacked NATO at any point in this war, and there's a reason why NATO is very clear that it doesn't itself want to get into a conflict with Russia. But I think what we have seen is that Russia has tried to intimidate not just NATO, but Ukraine itself and the international community more broadly. You could argue they've tried to coerce us with the threat of nuclear use, and I would argue it hasn't really worked. And one of the reasons it hasn't really worked is that taboo is still so strong. It's deeply irresponsible even to threaten the use of nuclear weapons or to make all sorts of wild claims about changing your posture. And I think what Russia is now doing, making such a public show of saying it's going to move nuclear weapons into Belarus, I think that is part of that intimidation and coercion. But I would argue it's not working. And using nuclear weapons would still be a huge step that I think Russia wouldn't take lightly. And I think we understand that, they understand it, and that's why that coercion is not working the way that perhaps they intend.
But should NATO just disregard those threats, or should we rethink our nuclear posture, reacting to what's happening on the ground, probably not only in Europe, but further away? So what NATO should do in this situation?
So look, nuclear is one of those areas where you should never be complacent and you should take everything seriously, and we do. Because even if the likelihood of an event is low, the impact would be horrific. So we do take this really seriously, and NATO has spent a lot of time over the last 18 months, and indeed going back further than that, reflecting on our own nuclear posture and making sure that it is predictable, stable, but also credible. And that means exercising, it means demonstrating our capability, it means the kind of investments that lots of allies are making at the moment, whether that's the US and France and the UK, all putting considerable investment in the moment into modernizing their nuclear forces so that they are credible for the future. But also, allies who participate in the nuclear sharing arrangements in NATO, like Germany and others, who are investing heavily in the capabilities they need for that mission to be credible well into the 21st century. So I think being credible on our own deterrence, communicating that so that any potential adversary knows that it's there, it's unchanging, and it's serious, I think that is ultimately the best way of reducing the risks.
You've touched upon the issue of nuclear sharing. Do you think that it could be expanded, or NATO-Russia Founding Act is still limiting us?
Well, look, our nuclear sharing arrangements go back to the 1960s, and they have been very stable throughout that period. Now, we keep posture under review all the time. There are also lots of different ways in which allies can contribute to our nuclear sharing arrangements. It's not just allies that have nuclear weapons, American nuclear weapons stationed in their country. It's also the contribution you can make, for example, to the wider air mission, to suppression of enemy air defenses. There are all sorts of important roles, and that's exactly what we keep under review. And we will always be driven by the threat and what is the best, most credible military way to respond to that threat. That's what's driving us.
But you didn't answer my question regarding NATO-Russia Founding Act. Is it still limiting us? Because when it comes to nuclear, everyone brings it to the table. We don't believe that it's functioning because Russia has breached it on numerous times. But when the nuclear issue is being raised, it's brought back to the table.
Yeah.
So is it still functioning?
We've been very clear that we will take the sovereign decisions as an alliance that we need to take to maintain our deterrence and our defence. That's what we'll do. That isn't constrained.
Thank you. And I'll turn to Nicola, and I'll ask the similar question, but a bit in a different way, from a different angle. Back to Putin's nuclear saber rattling. Does it make impression in national capitals? How does it impact our decision making? For instance, with respect to the military aid for Ukraine, or potentially also giving the membership to Ukraine. So does it have an impact on our national decision makers?
Absolutely. I think I fully agree with, I will say, the sense of your questions, because if we look back to the last 2 decades, or more precisely the last 22 years, in fact, I will say that the Russian blackmail worked, and it allows Putin, in fact, to win all its wars. In Georgia, before in Chechnya, of course, in Syria, in a way, of course, in Ukraine during the period at least 2014-2022. And in fact, you had always, I mean, this fear coming from the West that this threat was credible. And I think that as a response to the threat, the world leaders were not able to say, well, we are not a threat. And in fact, still now, in fact, we are not giving Ukraine all the weapons it needs. Basically, in my view, because of this threat. And I just welcome, my President Emmanuel Macron's decision today to provide Ukraine with Scalp long-range missiles. And I hope that it will have some effects also on Washington, D.C. But having said that, I still consider that we are too much buying the alleged red lines put by Russia on this because of basically these threats. And always, for instance, I was advocating since the first day of the war, February 24th, 2022, the fact that we should take actions according to the Article 51 of the UN Charter. Because not only we know Ukraine could retaliate to the attack, but we in the West, we are legitimate to help Ukraine just to counter the threats and the attack. We didn't. And in my view, you have this kind of nuclear blackmail still functioning right now. Of course, and I fully agree with what everything Angus said just at the moment, we have to take, any kind of nuclear threats seriously. It means that we have to monitor. We must have very clear intelligence assessment on what Russia and other nuclear powers are doing. Certainly we must absolutely do that. And we have also to be very clear and to assess, I know how difficult it is, the chain of command in Russia. We know that we are 3 persons that are needed to push on the button: Putin, Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, the Chief of Staff of the Army. And there will be other people, certainly, who will be very needed to take concretely action. So we have to assess everything. But the idea is that there are still red lines and there are some things that we cannot do is completely, in my view, a blunder. Let me adjust a thing. If we had taken actions more decisively at the beginning of the war, not only we would have saved thousands, I would say dozens of thousands of lives, of Ukrainian lives, but certainly we could have basically prevented at the earliest possible stage any kind of risk of war. And the more, we are hesitating, I will say the more, even if, in my view, at very, very, very low level, the risk is increasing.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, okay, in academia, at the decision-making level, it is clear your recipe is to monitor but not to overreact. But how to calm down the societies? Because they see those terrible headlines and they react, and politicians have to react to their reaction. So that is the first question. And the second one, which is related, why nuclear saber rattling is more effective in the Western societies, in the countries which are further away from Russia, than in the countries which can feel immediate threat from Russia. Why is this happening?
I think that I will, if you allow me, just to answer your second points before. First of all, we must not underestimate the depths of the Russian propaganda in the Western societies. I remember, in many TV shows, not only in my country, in France, but also, in the UK, in Germany, in some other country, in the US as well, you had, hidden Russian propagandists saying, well, we must not deliver weapons to Ukraine because otherwise Russia will nuke them and us. And you had those propagandists saying, okay, we want to save Ukrainian lives, but because of that, we don't have to send weapons to them, because of the nuclear threats. So, we must not underestimate this hidden propaganda. And then, of course, it had effects on the average people. And because the average people, of course, could fear, and that's a legitimate fear, the use of nuclear weapons that must remain something absolutely unacceptable. I think that we certainly, were, I will say, insufficiently dealt with this kind of issue, just to offer the counter-arguments to those propagandists coming not only, I would say, from the government and the senior officials, but also for the media who studied very clearly, this kind of issue. And then on your first questions, first of all, I think we have to send the right signal. First of all, if we have, and we had some, world democratic leaders saying, well, there is a true risk, that's the best, very bad message to the public opinion. Second, and we did so, we must make very clear that we have sent some messages to Russia. Third thing, we must not accredit the idea of a kind of World War III, because immediately, and that's part of the Russian propaganda, use of nuclear weapons means, of course, the annihilation of the Earth and World War III. No, it's not the case, because for very one reason that, all the specialists perfectly know, we can answer to nuclear threats through conventional means. And I think that there was the idea, especially because we in Europe also haven't devoted enough means to the reinforcements or conventional army, that, it was only the questions of, rivalry between the great powers was only a question of nuclear threats. And the fact is not. The fact is that was fully predictable. No, we have a conventional war waged by Russia in Europe, and we are able to answer conventionally. And even if there is a nuclear threat, we can also answer conventionally. And I think that's a very important message, also to reassure the public opinion.
So, potential of answering nuclear threats with conventional weapons is key also in reassuring the society.
Absolutely.
And my last question takes me a bit further away from Ukraine, but what's happening in Ukraine is used as a test ground or as a simulation for countries which are a bit further away. And what we do there, how we as collective West react in what's happening in Ukraine is considered and taken as a certain, lessons learned by those countries in their projection of how to behave, what to do themselves. And I mean China. China is looking very precisely at what's happening in Ukraine, conventionally, how we are reacting to what's happening in Ukraine, but also in terms of our nuclear messaging and our nuclear posture. And my question is, Lithuania just 2 weeks ago has adopted the Indo-Pacific strategy. Does NATO have to have something similar, to have an Indo-Pacific strategy, also including a very clear stance, nuclear posture vis-à-vis China?
Absolutely, and I think that first of all, I think what we are doing in Ukraine is certainly a message that we send to People's Republic of China, obviously. And the fact is that if we let, a nuclear power, namely Russia, deter us and limit, and I will also self-deter ourselves and limit our willingness to take action in Ukraine, it will be certainly the wrong signal sent to Beijing. That's absolutely true. And I think that, of course, Beijing is watching that very carefully, because if you are a nuclear power and you say, okay, you can dictate your conditions to the planet, to everyone, you can invade the neighboring country, they can shatter, the world order, then, there will be absolutely no peace. And that's true for China, but that could be also true for some minor nuclear powers. In regional conflicts especially, and we have many other examples. Then the second thing is the real issue. Some analysts are still talking about red lines. I said before that we don't have to buy, the red lines from China, and from Russia, for both countries, in fact. But I think we have also to be credible on all red lines. And then two issues. First of all, we have, the worst examples, during the last decade was the examples of Obama's so-called red lines, in Syria in 2013, that were never enforced after the chemical attack on the Ghouta. And I think that everything that comes after that, in Syria, where the war is still ongoing, and Russia is still shelling the civilians there, and of course in Ukraine, also is coming from, the lack of credibility. And I remember had that period of time of just 1 year after trips to Japan and South Korea and discussed with senior officials, and they said, well, what's about the credibility? And that was the questions. And the second point is that, well, we are talking about nuclear threats, but the nuclear threat coming from Russia is exactly the same towards NATO country that it is towards Ukraine. So that makes the difference. And I think that if we want to be credible, that's my argument in 1.5 years, if you want to be credible, in our deterrence for NATO country, we must be also credible in facing the war waged by Russia against Ukraine.
Thank you. Julia, I'd like to ask a bit different question. Although nuclear disasters happening in nuclear power plants usually are put in the same basket as the nuclear warfare, and the risks are evaluated pretty much on the same level, but it's a sort of a different problem. So my question is, what is your take, what is your assessment on the potential of the nuclear disaster in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, how we should reduce these risks, and is there any role for NATO in the scenario?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to mention that I don't see a particular NATO responsibility for solving the issue, because the main responsibility lies with Russia. And Moscow has deliberately created that situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and it's continuing to do so. That doesn't mean that there is no role for NATO or NATO member states at all. But maybe let me start by saying something about different risks, nuclear-related risks, because as you correctly said, these types of risks, different types of risks related to nuclear weapons or nuclear radiation are very often, or military risks are very often mixed together. And that creates something like, it contributes to Russian efforts of creating this fog of war. So first of all, we have military risks. So risks in the conventional field, for example, hazardous military encounters, for example, in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, especially in congested areas, smaller areas. You could say now with NATO enlargement, the Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake. So you can see when tensions are on the rise, especially between nuclear weapon states or between a nuclear weapon state and countries that are members of a nuclear alliance, you have a greater risk for escalation. And that could always, in the worst case, go to a nuclear area, also even if the risk is rather low. And then you have risks typically related to nuclear weapons that are risks related to doctrinal use, to escalatory use. And for both of these baskets, so you can put both of these risks into different baskets, and you have risk reduction measures that you can apply in both areas. So, for example, managing dangerous encounters over the high seas, or between military aircraft and military vessels, or even between civilian aircraft and military aircraft, something like this. And in the nuclear field, nuclear weapons field, you can apply risk reduction measures like talking about doctrines, trying to decrease ambiguity, creating more transparency. There are different types of approaches, and it's important to say that NATO itself is not doing any agreements. So NATO is a platform for discussing risk reduction and arms control. NATO is not signing any arms control agreements or risk reduction agreements. And now, that was a bit of an introduction. Now I come to the situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, because that's quite different. It's not related to nuclear weapons, although in the public perceptions, it's almost mixed together. Risks around nuclear power plants and potential incidents are very, very different from the use of a strategic or tactical nuclear weapon. And what we see there is more related to these threat scenarios about around CBRN issues, around issues related to chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear issues. So that's a whole different basket. And right now we see that the IAEA is doing a great job in being there on the ground, having a mission there. And what they are doing is mostly observing the situation and doing myth busting, because that's quite important to inform the public, to inform decision makers what's going on there. And quite often that differs a lot from public perception. And what I think is important also in a NATO context to consider is that I think the situation around Zaporizhzhia is something that you can put into the basket of hybrid threats rather than classical nuclear threats, because it plays into that game of creating disinformation, of creating a dangerous situation over a long period of time while pursuing other activities in parallel. It's also about influencing the public. You've raised the issue of public perception. So when we think back to Fukushima in 2011, that had a huge impact on public perception about nuclear power plants. So this is, for the Russian side, a very good issue of just trying to influence public perception. So I think the least thing that NATO could do would consider these kinds of threats as part of the broader Russian hybrid strategy and not consider this as an isolated event, but rather as something that it could inform our risk assessments in the future.
But are there any measures that we can take to prevent situations like that? I'm just pondering upon one situation. There was in the recent news a message that the Wagner troops have been approaching one of the nuclear plants in Russia, and also Russian armed forces are mining the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So it's definitely not the matter for International Atomic Agency, but do we have any measures to prevent that?
Well, unfortunately, you don't have something like the creation of a security zone around nuclear power plants. Ideally, you would have that on a global scale, like something like a norm or an agreement that you must not interfere with nuclear power plants when there is a conflict or crisis whatsoever. Unfortunately, something like this doesn't exist, even not on a unilateral level. For example, states could unilaterally declare that they will not attack nuclear power plants whatsoever. Unfortunately, something like this doesn't exist. It's a bit like I would compare that dilemma with the cybersphere, where it would be great to have norms, especially norms that you could apply to critical infrastructure, but you don't have them. And I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but realistically, I don't see that happening, because it's just going back to the Russian side and to Zaporizhzhia, it's just a very practical issue to create a threat scenario without actually doing something. Like it's still under the level of military activity. Well, apart from the shelling that has happened, especially and is still ongoing, but on the basis it's below back to the Russian side and to Zaporizhzhia. It's just a very practical issue to create a threat scenario without actually doing something. Like it's still under the level of military activity. Well, apart from the shelling that has happened, especially and is still ongoing, but on the basis it's below the level of military activity. So it's a very practical tool. And then the question is, why should you subscribe to such a norm if it serves your interests and if you don't have like an immediate motivation to just not do that?
I think that in general, and in particular in the nuclear field, we are facing this dilemma. Norms and agreements are usually the ones who are creating trust, reducing uncertainty, ensuring stability. But at the moment, there is no appetite for arms control because we have to deter. So what is the future of the arms control in nuclear fields? What's your take? I know it's a very difficult and broad question. But.
Well, it's a question that many people are asking right now, and rightly so, because a common saying is you don't do arms control with your friends, and maybe you don't do risk reduction with your friends, but you do that in a crisis. And when we look back at the Cold War, we can see that the initial impulse to do risk reduction and arms control started after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the actors just realized we don't do arms control because we want to please others, but we want to be safe ourselves. The problem right now is arms control treaties, as we all know, have eroded. We don't have that basis anymore, so we have to go back to the very basics, and the basics are risk reduction. So how can we avoid nuclear war? And that is a very technical question for the Western part and for the NATO side. For Russia and China, it's a very political question. So they want issues like Ukraine to be solved, like for Russia, to be solved before they enter into a conversation about risk reduction measures. Something I mentioned that in the beginning about transparency, understanding each other's doctrine, trying to make a bit clearer what are the scenarios of nuclear use on each of the sides, something like this. But it's hard to start a conversation with the other side if the other side doesn't want to do that. So quite recently, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just re-emphasized that you could, in fact, discuss about risk reduction issues as a matter of compartmentalization. So you keep that separate from the overall situation. And that was put on the table, and those of you who read the statement by Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov know that this was kind of politicized by the Russian side. So, in fact, compartmentalization is not something that the US invented or NATO invented, but something that served the interests of both sides during the Cold War, and right now it's being politicized and framed as something that serves US interests. But maybe to give it a slightly, well, wouldn't say optimistic turn, but something that NATO can do is looking at all the matters that might be applicable once the hot phase or the fighting in Ukraine is over, something that could be done in the future, especially on the very technical level of risk reduction. And also maybe one thing, if I may add that, it's also very important to consider how all the activities that the West is pursuing with regards to nuclear weapons, with regards to Russia, are informing or maybe even shaping Chinese behavior in the future. So, as you said, China is looking very carefully what's happening in Ukraine, and how we shape deterrence, how we act, will inform Chinese nuclear buildup or the way China is engaging in arms control and risk reduction in the future.
Maybe this compartmentalization also the strategy to engage China to get it on board. So on this positive, optimistic note, I'm opening the floor for the questions from the audience. And I'll take the questions from your seats, but then I'll ask you to go to the fixed microphone in the middle. So start from there, and yeah. Okay.
Hello, Tomasz Szmura, Kazimierz Płaski Foundation, Warsaw Security Forum. I've got a question to Assistant Secretary General Lapsley on the nuclear sharing, of course. Probably you might hear that advisor to the President of Poland today informed that Poland will be willing to contribute more to nuclear sharing as we in the process of the procurement of the F-35, still having a significant fleet of F-16. You are working, on the daily basis with the allies, nuclear sharing participants. So what are the moods in NATO HQ in this particular topic? Do you think that this approach is welcome or not really? And if such kind of contribution, it's welcome and expected. Thank you.
We'll take another question and one from the Slido, and then I'll let you answer, and then we'll have a second round. So there was a gentleman who just went there. So could you please? Okay, no, not you. Yeah, the one who is closer to me. Yeah, right. Sorry.
Absolutely. Erwan Lagadek from the Atlantic Council and George Washington University. A couple of quick things. Is it your view that the US and the UK especially have been true to the Budapest Memorandum in terms of its deterrence value vis-à-vis the Ukrainian decision to get rid of their post-Soviet nuclear weapons? And number two, we are seeing an increasing number of media pieces about the influence of the Orthodox establishment vis-à-vis the doctrine of nuclear weapons use. In fact, there's a new book about the way in which the far right in Russia is increasingly influenced by Orthodox millenarian thinking about using nukes. Do you think there's value to that, or should we in fact be on the lookout for Russia planting stories about the Orthodox Church pushing for a much more aggressive doctrine on nuclear weapons as a way to use the madman theory of nuclear doctrine? Thanks.
And this question goes to whom? To all the panelists. Okay. And the last question comes from Slido regarding nuclear weapons in Belarus. Does NATO perceive this as imbalance in deterrence, which consequently requires the deployment of nuclear weapons to Eastern Europe? So we'll start probably with Angus and then Nicola.
Well, on the question on Poland, I mean, actually, I thought your question had all the elements of the answer in it. Poland is part of the nuclear planning group, which is the body of NATO ministers minus France, which has a special status, which decides nuclear posture and nuclear policy, and it's a very active member of that group. Poland is deciding what the future should be. As you brought out, as Poland develops an F-35 force, along with many other countries in Northern Europe, it becomes a very potent contributor to how we maintain not just nuclear deterrence but conventional deterrence. And I would strongly agree with what Nicola said earlier, that actually the best way to avoid ever getting into the situation where we need nuclear deterrence is to have strong conventional deterrence in the first place. And on Belarus, I would say we are very confident that our own nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis Russia is holding and is right for the threat that we face. And moving nuclear weapons into Belarus would be an irresponsible step. There's no justification for it, but it would not weaken our ability to deter an attack on NATO. We're very clear about that.
Thank you, Nicola.
Yes, I think there are two things. First of all, about the violations of the memorandum of Budapest by Russia. It's absolutely true that it was absolutely not acceptable, but that was part of the weak responses of the West that are already described after, all the massacres committed by Russia, in Georgia, mostly in Syria, and in Ukraine. And I think the lack of response was certainly the bad signal, because, as in Syria, at that time, I think that the questions of the nuclear blackmail was not, real, just this one. It was not a nuclear blackmail at that time. And in fact, the fact is that basically we were as weak because we feared, I don't know what exactly. Coming about, very interesting questions about the so-called Orthodox Church of Russia. So-called, because that has nothing to do with the church, in my view, and with the values of the Bible or anything like this. But which is absolutely true is that we are witnessing, a kind of mood since more than 30 years, in fact, in Russia, of this kind of millenarist narratives. The cult of the death is something very frequent. We have, of course, some priests who were basically praising, all the massacres and the war crimes against humanity of the Russian soldiers, in Ukraine. And you have, sorry, I wrote a long piece about that, so I won't be long now. There is, this very ideology of Putin, which is based on destructions. Not only the destructions of the Chechens, the Syrians, the Georgians, the Ukrainians, etc., but the destructions of its own people. And I think we have certainly to pay a great deal of attention to ideology, because also mafia guys could have an ideology for their own purposes, and we must not forget that. Just a very quick word on Belarus. I think we have also to remind, first of all, that it is another violation of the Budapest Memorandum. And the second thing is a true violation as well of the constitutions of Belarus and Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. Julia, what's your take?
I will probably skip the question about the Orthodox Church because I don't know enough about it. Maybe also on nuclear weapons in Belarus or nuclear weapons eastwards, broadening the DCA mission. First of all, I don't think nuclear weapons in Belarus are changing the calculus or changing the overall strategic thinking. We've already discussed that NATO nuclear deterrence works. So I think that's the baseline. And then two things that I would like to add. First of all, I don't think we should fall into the trap of tit-for-tat strategy. So what Russia is doing, and starting with, again, with Zaporizhzhia, with very vague or explicit threats around the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, to allegations against Ukraine of using a dirty bomb. Russia is trying to create a very confusing, very fog of war-like nuclear scenario. And I think the best choice for NATO is to stick to the very strong and effective strategy, nuclear strategy that it has, which is based on coherence, it is based on consistency. So I would really warn anyone to fall into that tit-for-tat strategy. And then last point, maybe looking a bit at the broader picture, if we talk about additional deployment countries for NATO nuclear weapons, the West will certainly have to answer questions in the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences. That might not sound very relevant for this forum, but I can tell you why it is relevant. Because as West, we are not, in terms of population, the majority of the global population. So there are many countries on the brink, and our interest is that Russia doesn't gain supporters over the longer term. We don't want Russia to be surrounded by states in the global south. So we should be very careful how we behave in different formats because they are all connected. So if there are questions in the NPT regarding that issue, I think we risk that basis of support for Ukraine. That's very much looking at the broader picture, but and I know we're running out of time, but I think it makes sense to think about the wider implications.
Thank you very much. So I think that major takeaways is that nuclear is very dangerous, so we have to be careful with nuclear, and first of all, we have to be careful and not get involved in this tit-for-tat strategy, because it might lead us on very dangerous path. But it is important to be prepared and not to be too complacent, to adapt, to rethink our posture, but not also to succumb to nuclear saber rattling and be resilient vis-à-vis nuclear saber rattling, monitor but not overreact, and also reassure the societies, which also react in a very sometimes hysteric way, because nuclear is dangerous and very toxic. And although there is no probably room today for arms control negotiations, but we will have to come back to these negotiations when the war is over. And as Julia suggested, probably these conversations have to be compartmentalized, and it's not only taking Russia on board, but also China and potentially other players. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me close this panel and thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you very much.
Now, a short announcement that the session we were supposed to have at 16:40 may be moved to tomorrow. And the second one, we are going to have a coffee break, long-awaited coffee break, 20 minutes. After that, we will go live with Washington, D.C. Please be back in 20 minutes.